Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval and early modern mercenarism and good old military life, approaching it from both a political and societal perspective, but highlighting essentially the somehow categoristic mistakes that we make when we think about mercenarism as a essentially detached activity from the, say, regular soldiery one. At least in the sense that we decided to negatively load in terms of bias, and that does not really help understanding essentially the motivations that were present behind these historical figures. Recently I made a video about Renaissance mercenaries. We talked a lot about them. In that case it was the Reisläufer, the Landsknechte. But in fact, it's incredibly important to start from medieval times, because most of the time we hear about mercenaries, essentially, we do so from a modern, even contemporary perspective that tends, in fact, to categorize them in the many modernistic and secularistic fashion that we do by wanting almost to distinguish the Middle Ages from the later periods, and together with its values, with its morals, and in fact also loading this era in some sort of negative bias that, of course, that doesn't make any sense. So we are on Schwerpunkt. I made thousands of videos more or less revolving around the same topics. I don't have further introductions to make. We will just look at something we already saw, of course, in part, but also highlighting this latter dimension. So you can argue that the so-called feudal Middle Ages, some people even debate regarding the idea of the existence of feudalism. I mean, to an extent, in my opinion, it's a waste of time, but I will not explain in this video at least why, had witnessed an elite of military professionals elevating on the crowds, on the mobs of the apparently defenseless, but only apparently, in fact, defenseless rustics, the rustici in Latin. This is a very important concept indeed, because as we just pointed out, medieval society was not ever that pacified, right? There wasn't ever in the Middle Ages that degree, for example, of societal control of disarmament that occurred in the modern contemporary era. Of course, you can point out that civilization actually does concentrate power in more effective, orderly ways. But of course, we have to contextualize this in an age in which that system not just had not developed, but was being developed in this moment, right? That's also among not just liberals, but even conservatives, the extremely odd historical mistake of considering, at some point, either the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, civilization popped out because, science and stuff, and so everything that existed before was a dysfunctional mess of anarchy and, obscurity. Of course, there is probably no Western identity in a statement like this whatsoever. But even more than that, because, of course, the power of medieval armies did revolve, according to the traditional doctrine, if you want, on the strength generated by the actually conflictual relation between the estates. We have seen this also in other periods, like, the extension of the imperium to the plebeian magistracies in mid-Republican Rome that gave birth to the manipular army that was effectively the one who took over the Mediterranean, all framing this, in fact, in a heavily hierarchical, right, and quite, for this reason, also quite disciplined and compact system. The Middle Ages had been somehow the same. Some parts of medieval Europe were much more militarized in terms of, locals habitually participating to some kind of military action than even the Prussian population at the time of Frederick the Great, that we incidentally discussed also just the other day. Indeed, however, it is true that feudalism had essentially managed to establish a new order after the collapse of antiquity, the exhaustion of the system, something that is metaphysical in concept and really encompassed basically all of Eurasia, right? And had struck, in fact, those very societies that sometimes are perceived as, the barbarians won. Not quite. First of all, the greater military powers were always the more Romanized. There were the countries that essentially emerged from the not even the ashes, but the ruins, or even just from the relics, and even the still quite living ones of the western half of the Roman Empire, right? France, Italy, England, Spain, parts of Germany, etc. It is true, however, that the feudal order had affirmed itself as a sort of broader shortcoming from the prior system. There had been big outbursts of power, like in the Carolingian era. The later Middle Ages are definitely a much more powerful time than even antiquity, lacking, however, unitarity and making up for it with some kind, in fact, of more localistic, autonomistic powers that largely were like this, exactly because the local population had somehow, in the gradual degeneration, moral degeneration of mankind throughout the millennia, entrusted themselves to these individuals, right? It doesn't make much sense to say, but they were oppressed, or, it was just like, instead they fully delivered this power to it was both at the same time. You can never distinguish the two things if you think about it. There are some scholars also had some debate with on the same topic. There are somehow, much more sort of, poor people that were, imposed seigneuries, monarchies, whatever. But actually, even when this was an impositive, can be described, at least in some elements, as an impositive dynamic, this still stemmed essentially from some people that, for the same fact that they were still alive, and also not that unwell overall, in a broader civilizational sense, especially in Europe, definitely proved that if that they were okay with the thing, otherwise they would have been dead, right? Arms in hands, and instead began to build like a system that also, how it was traditionally conceived, needed a leader, needed an order, right? And we have seen how, in fact, even in the vexata quest of the Indo-European tripartite order, in fact, there are overlappings, right? You have kings that are also knights, for example. You have monks that are also knights themselves. You have even, in fact, bellatores that are laboratores, and more, right? So the system that we witnessed during the Middle Ages is one that allowed definitely that development of a professional corps, the equivalent to what essentially a permanent army would have been. We often say, what was the first permanent army? Because in the Middle Ages, at least they had stopped having it. When did it appear again? You cannot really distinguish that. Like an Uskar, if it is permanently maintained by his lord, is de facto permanent armed force of some kind. Except, of course, it's not that there aren't many of them, that they don't have this great level of coordination, of collective training in the ranges of, I don't know, the thousands or the tens of thousands. But they are also incredibly effective fighters in that era, right? There is all, as you know, a spectrum of this. How Oscar would be out there in, say, in an Anglo-Danish context that eventually passed to instead something much more robust, like the Norman one, just to stick to Britain for that matter. And you understand even how they are, like, these people's even ancestries intertwined, so that there weren't admittedly radical cultural divides, but indeed military systems did scale up to an important degree during the Middle Ages as well. The professionals of war remaining, however, always at the core of this. even when you have like entire armies, essentially the backbone is constituted by men-at-arms that are often noblemen or people that are de facto equating that at a level at least of social status, and that can in fact afford the kind of lifestyle, technique, expertise to begin with, right? And this order does go on for a very long time, because indeed, even if there were stratifications in this order, in the say knightly ranking, in nobility, you can argue, as I always say, that the Middle Ages, like that core, like that idea of how an army is actually built, fundamentally does not end until 1792 or 1918, depending in which parts of Europe you're looking at. The political and social balances change, warfare, technically speaking, changes, but the idea that there had been a core of aristocrats holding like the entire system, as in fact like the same Hellenic term means, like the better ones were people that could in fact make up for that human degeneration we were talking about before, and sort of reviving it through still this warband mentality was pretty much alive until a century ago, really. This came with some actual quality that was not just, okay, I make war so I'm better. No, that's not how it works. Like, in fact, if anything, the tendency was to always, like, on average, first of all, warriors were not even warriors technically. In fact, they were militias from a numerical point of view, and so they were a bit like cannon fodder. But also later on, the same ancien regime entered a crisis that was due to the sort of gentrification, the softening up of the same establishment that did keep making a lot of war, but essentially making up for these individual deficiencies with some sort of organized and absolutely powerful capacity that we call civilization. That, however, again diminished greatly the individual quality. It's like saying, I don't know, was a Swiss pikeman any better than a man-at-arms in the 15th century? Hell no, right? It was completely worthless individually, but framed under actually other men-at-arms that could give that collective order and pay for this massive formations of pikemen that, again, were also, in terms of fencing, completely primitive, rough. There was not much of a sophistication there. Of course, they could beat armies of men-at-arms as well, right? Individually, it's a completely different story. And so, of course, this is relevant because there is also traditionally a power being displayed there that evidently stems from, at that point, like a collective value that does show how civilization can maintain, albeit scaling down certain elements of the same, the way of making things work. Right? The problem is when, at some point, the individual starts being so detached from even the purpose of what civilization is, that the same civilization can decline, will also stratify once again, will need, in fact, again, that sort of aristocratic establishment. But aside from this, within a complex system of selection and of roles repartition, the milites, so what you would conventionally call the knights, or say the professional soldiers put in this way, in the Middle Ages, could also, at least up to the 12th century, roughly, but with important variations, especially from place to place, come from a low origin. Right? Things start to change later at different levels, because at least until up through like the entire 13th and early 14th century, there's a great deal of social promotion, because medieval civilization is still expanding. But indeed, the lock of knighthood as a sort of higher nobility, at least knighthood intended, in fact, with the dubbing, with some sort of greater social display rather than strictly military practice, occurs in the third quarter of the 12th century. Right, so this is not to say that these troops were actually less effective. They were, on average, but there were at this point many other lower knights, so the smaller aristocracy again that would remain also to sustain ancient armies until the 18th, the 19th century. Poorer, in fact, fighters that were in their clientele, in their retinue, and that tend also to homogenize in terms of that, at least throughout the 13th century, as basically an equal type of fighter, but distinguished by a different social, political condition. Some here we can't, as you understand here, descend too much into details, but just think about, we made so many videos about the German ministeriales. There were serfs, right? They're an actual exception in Europe from a juridical point of view, but they even in the 13th century become sometimes even more powerful socially than some free noblemen in Germany. There are parallels also in other cultures. We've seen the Mamluks, for example, that today we stick to Europe, to Western Europe in general. And when you look at the normality of knighthood during these centuries, you realize that, exceptions aside, essentially most of these soldiers would, in spite of being something really different from the average villain on foot, of course never rise beyond the level of bodyguards. Again, individual fighters, both individually and collectively, but still not essentially people who could break the mold and simply affirm themselves as a simple estate. In fact, this is also a very interesting and underrated part. Like that, we've seen it in different countries. It was true in England and in Germany, but in different ways. There was an actual estate of knights represented in the parliament. It's difficult to call it estate in an absolute sense, meaning that very often, that this estate is not really the classical one. You have the first, the second. In theory, they belong to the first, right? But even there, like how many individuals were more powerful than some of these guys, even from the third estate, right? And there are so many varying conditions that, in fact, this knightly estate is hardly ever, let's say, very incisive, politically wise. They are important because they are the guys who are meant to bear arms. They really have a great significance, even at a local level. They are people worth of trust. They help enforcing justice, and so on. But aside from the general gentrification during the modern era, even medieval times, these individuals tend to be pushed towards the lower echelons of society. We've seen it in Hungary, for example, or these massive oligarchs, and then there are knights, but sometimes you can confuse them, the gradual disarmament of the same, also in Poland, to some sort of local gentry, rather than a veritable professional class that you can simply rely on, also in a military sense. This is why, as you understand, we also talk about mercenaries at that point, because if the effort of ever more concentrated powers was to sort of disarm the locals, at some point you had to fight with some bulk of force, and it was much easier to simply hire soldiers, and maybe were also your subjects, but you could find connected to a much broader market of, in fact, often foreign troops, that you could simply discharge at another point. You didn't have any other obligation towards, in a political sense, other than, in fact, a contractual one, as veritable professionals of warfare. It's also true that the traditional knight, doesn't matter how poor at some point, and for this reason also often becoming a mercenary because he wouldn't be able to live off of his meager domains, was, however, ruling over some sort of seigneury. Like, this was recognized. It's as if this was the truth in Europe up to a couple of centuries ago. The entire, say, you went out in the country, and this was essentially parceled into many seigneuries, right? Sometimes minuscule ones, apparently, especially from today's point of view, considering that people were much poorer at the time. So in terms of material wealth, etc., there were bigger communities, institutions. I don't know. The cities were very important. Like, there were much greater estates that were the royal domains and so on. So everything was of a very complex melange. But these individuals that were meant to serve the sovereign, because they were born as a race of fighters, was the normality at the time. And it's something so self-evident when you actually study, as we did recently, for example, with the Mousquetaires de la Maison du Roi for France, or some other, we're talking about the Junkers the other day for Frederick the Great. Like, how bloody the toll for serving the sovereign was, and how determined, convinced, and simply loyal and disciplined these individuals were in that duty. Because in part there was a lot to get back from it. Those seigneuries could have aspired to something more. These people could have been rewarded. They would have actually, as we'll see now, lost this seigneury hadn't they provided the military service. So everything was difficult. From the Middle Ages, it's as if like all these seigneuries were some sort of local mob that had somehow to balance up with the bigger ones, but also with the smaller ones. And so you understand very well the level of, say, clientery and hierarchical relations that brought ultimately, were ultimately functional, if anything, to the gathering of an army that could be, in fact, composed by the people who were really capable of fighting, who were really worth it, and that had a general interest in holding the system, holding the establishment. So some knights, as we were saying before, this is also how they had emerged. If you look at the Carolingian era, you realize that, and this is true for basically all the older laws of recruitment in the Romano-Germanic world, like every freeman, as you know, was meant to contribute to the army. It was actually a duty and a privilege. And this was normally, initially, like, say, regulated through census, right? Or better, all these cultures came from a pre-Statal reality, right? So what you had was what you were in many ways. Then you have states like in the Romano-Germanic period that still have the concept of, say, like, first of all, freemen have to go at war, but they have to do it proportionally to their wealth, to how they can be equipped fundamentally, and that's when things got a bit more feudal, because there is a stark divide between sort of the first class, that is the heavily armored knight, and basically any other typology, even mounted but still lighter forces below, etc. Equally, later, even during the Middle Ages, there is the reinforcement of this elite, so this stark division from the rest of the population, as we've seen. But during the modern age, you re-witness a sort of gentrification, etc., for which many of these knights would turn into administrators of goods. That, for this reason, were not just knights, but on the basis of that seigneury, they were expected to take on some jurisdictional characteristic, right? That's what the count does, ideally. But there are many, like in this case, there's the retinue of the count that is made up of knights themselves, and those have little seigneuries that, in the sense, are not really framed within like the historical, like Carolingian comital order, and that, however, are recognized on the basis of their integrity, of their honor, of their power as men, as noble men. Right? Those who have managed to maintain that, because originally in Romano-Germanic societies, every freeman was noble. In fact, we will see how in other parts of Europe, where the concept of citizenry had remained more intact since Roman times, actually these are not just pretty good soldiers, but they have an identity that revolves around nobility in arms, just for the fact of being free, and on the basis of census. That, especially in the sort of Franco-Germanic feudalism, seems that is the more oligarchic and privatized, was surpassed by the sheer divide existing between the richest and the rest of the population. All right. So it's a very interesting topic, because this is if there had been two types of feudalism in Europe, one of, again, Franco-Germanic kind and some sort of Mediterranean one, or so-called Mediterranean one. Actually, all of Europe was feudal, even in the most sort of republican parts, so much so that the same communes were ruled everywhere by knights, regardless of how they were extracted, or by more ancient blood or census, that is individual wealth, and in any case the things match, the lifestyle match, the military characteristics, quality match, right? And we made, again, a lot of videos about this stuff, but we have only began to define this, like also on say, the military historical unit series. This is important, like even studying arms and armor really shows you how sort of homogeneous, especially in the later Middle Ages, Western European knighthood really was, at least the Western European men-at-arms had really become, right? In any case, regardless of the important divides that existed across Europe, we're talking of a privileged establishment, right? There are, say, so many varieties. It's not a dichotomic aspect, right? Think, for example, about the Italian patriciate, right, and how powerful and rich it becomes as it marries into royalty. Like we were talking about Milanese armor the other day. They're just highlighting how many, how heavy, in fact, like those kind of armors really were for the type of shock cavalry that they were destined to, also within a communal reality, and how the Visconti married into the Valois. And conversely, you had other parts of Europe that were in part more primitive and traditional, that upheld more that sense of original knighthood. You can look at the east, places like Transylvania, just to mention one, in realizing that they had stopped a bit more at the ancestral times, and they were more truly also stateless, and so closer to that sense of primal nobility in arms, but were also much less updated compared to Western men-at-arms, regardless of their extraction there. And so this is valid equally for what we said about collective versus individual. That's something we've seen even in the comparison between, let's say, the Western gendarmes and the Ottoman sipais, right? There were these kind of comparisons. Both observed the fact that basically Western charges were better, but individually, like, say, the sipai was sort of better in fighter, right? Except they would lose more often than not, regardless. That's a bit like the history of civilization in a nutshell. Also considering that where the sipai came from, there were many more sort of non-soldierly fighters than Europe instead, right? Even, I don't know, the German burghers, or the ones of the Austrian frontier fought against the Ottomans, were much sort of bulkier and tougher forces than, I don't know, the kind of peasantry the Ottomans could levy because they didn't really have the type of Western communalism and municipal pride, right? Historically, in lands that were less urbanized, were more exposed to the steppes, for example. So there is always balanced odds, so to say, as much as also the individual communities were balanced within themselves, right? As we were saying before, there is a difference between not just that sense of Transalpine and Cisalpine feudalism, the idea that, again, for example, the Transalpine world had not known much of a public culture, and the Franks had not really injected this. If anything, they had revived, and I made a bit about this, that sense of traditional Catholic respect towards those who could bear arms, and that therefore were also to be led by inspiration and charisma rather than some sort of enforcement. And in fact, a much more Romance world that was maintaining a great deal of public authority, of civic order, and communal later administration, that was able to field important armies made up of not just of warriors, let's say, of feudal lords, but of citizens in arms that could be both knights and, of course, like numerically speaking, it was true also all across the continent. Of course, foot troops were quite highly disciplined and capable even of withstanding the enemy knights. Another great divide is, however, chronological. I mean, from the 13th century, for example, Europe gets much more monetized, economically wise. Mercenarism is essentially surpassing all the previous sort of feudal levies systems. Had never really quite worked. I mean, that ideal that, yes, you basically give the beneficent to your vassals, and then this guy has simply to obey you. Well, the Carolingian Empire basically collapsed because of at least the end of the period in which the king could simply reward these men with conquest. At some point got overstretched, and these guys began to fight against one another. There was also a lot of compactness in Europe that we illustrated even in the apparently darker or allegedly darker times like the 10th century, that really show how the continent has an enormous potential that will boom in the following centuries in unprecedented ways, really. So mercenarism, what we call as mercenarism, kicks in more or less at that point, right? We made lots of videos, for example, about 13th century soldiers, wages, mount cost, etc. If anything, because from that era onwards, we're able to document this much better. And exactly because of all these monetary contracts, of course, like the spread of literacy, etc. But this is where, let's say, the condotta begins. This is where, say, the indenture also begins. Like, there is the idea that basically by the end of the 13th century, most troops are fundamentally just paid, right, in a way or another. Aside from, let's say, especially talking about this professional elements, right? They're not people simply going to work, even when, as we've seen, they were actually compelled to do so. Like, there were now habits of simply paying these individuals on a regular basis for doing so, which also in parallel and paradoxically, and that's why the same knightly certification is important. Now, the monarchs had more means to enact, right, to impose as a service, meaning that the soldiers would be paid because it was the easier way of making them work, but let's say they were paid also because they now tended to obey the king much more than before on that basis. Whereas, I don't know, in the previous century still there was a big deal of convincing even the major princes to serve along the king, right? So let's not even talk about all the people down the line. So there's a greater state, as a matter of fact, that is forming, especially in France under Louis IX, and generally speaking, all European communities, institutions are strengthening, are becoming bulkier, right? It's very, the 13th century is also the peak of chivalry, of some aspects of tradition that the Middle Ages had salvaged and re-edited, given the current human conditions. Again, so the 13th century is still like, it's basically the golden age of that sense of duty and honor and standard, as well as actual chivalric power, right? And after this period, especially with the crisis of the 14th century, there's a further statalization. There is a great series, crisis, of universalism, and with that, local countries basically began to statalize further on a regional basis. That was also to remain pretty similar to the one that we still have in Europe today from a political and geographical point of view. Now, nobody in this time really thought that being paid for going at war or by going at war was dishonorable, right? This is a concept that we start getting only in some times where either in the Renaissance or in the 19th century, the new updates in statal development bring to the ideal intention, in fact, of uniform, of nationalizing the native troops, right? And so which is always a very socialist, stratified concept, right? Like, I don't know, Machiavelli, we will see him later, didn't want simply, like, I don't know, the citizens of Florence to go at war. He was talking about the peasants of the Florentine Republic across Tuscany, rather, right? The 19th century is a bit similar. Yes, the idea of somebody fighting for a nation that is not his is seen like a sort of shame, sort of outcast. We talk about the French Foreign Legion, for that matter, that came from, in fact, an age of revolution, of exiles, of people that, in that sense, were also, say, thinking of different countries in terms of different political orientation. This is not so important now, but still, as we were saying before, in the 19th century, in large parts of Europe, first of all, there is no such thing like civic equality, right? Still, most people can't vote. And yet, of course, these largely fourth estaters now in a mass society are sent to the meat grinder in grandiose wars, even across very different theaters. Like if you think about the American Civil War, of the Crimean War, but still, right, they are essentially considered as say expendables in the hands of course, more important people that are running the system. That can also cooperate with other nations to a degree. So this is not a negative thing for that matter. It's rather, of course, like the standards now that were, as we were saying before, from an individual point of view, collapse. Now, speaking of that aforementioned difference between, let's say, a Franco-Germanic and a sort of Romance Mediterranean feudalism, right? Perhaps the divide in a military technical sense is exaggerated. I made so many videos about basically all the regions of Europe. We talked a lot about France, about Germany, about Italy. We could talk about Spain too, where there are the Caballeros Villanos, for example. We'll come back on that. Spain is somehow, like here, where you understand it's mostly like a post-Carolingian reality that had spread also places like England or Sicily, like more directly, that Frankish domination. The Spanish were very similar in that regard, but Iberia truly maintains some incredibly interesting, say, peculiar political and social dynamics, even from a military point of view. But looking at Italy, that is the more exceptional, the more unique, like distinctive civilization, arguably in Europe at this time, you realize that the communal army that we often point out as being overlooked, being actually one of the great, in fact, military, one of the greatest militaries of the Middle Ages, was not simply I don't know, as some people think, an anti-feudal system, or loaded with some kind of anti-traditional belief. I mean, you know that in general, right? But it's as if to say, since something is feudal, right? It works in one way. Since it's communal, it works in one other. So the product, also from a military point of view, should be different. This is somehow true to a qualitative extent, right? And it's difficult to discuss this. The idea, especially as we'll see now with mercenarism in early 14th century Italy, that was mostly made of Germans and French. There's this idea that Transalpine knights are better, saying, than Italian ones that are at least, actually at the same level, because some observers from England traveled also in later medieval Italy and said, oh, here all the gentlemen basically train in arms and so on. But there were less, right? Italy was incredibly rich, and thus, as we'll see now, some practice of delegating military service to somebody else was happening also in Transalpine Europe. Think about the scutage in England, right? And this is a datum, and the other being instead infantry forces, right? Transalpine Europe does not witness an infantry development equal to the one of equal and especially superior to the one of Italy, especially during the 13th and the 14th century, for which actually important wars like the ones of the Lombard Leagues notably brought to the defeat also of some of the strongest, in fact, cavalry forces at the time, like the imperial one at the time of Barbarossa. Still, however, always in a way in which the Italian knights were decisive, right? In fact, when you look at the entire 13th century, in some days I will make a video about Florence, for example, during that period. We'll have to dig a lot into that. The sense of the existence of a feudal militia, right, with domini and milites, etc., was pretty much alive across even a communally dominated country. We've seen recently in the video about 12th century Florence how basically the commune at that point, if anything, takes over the local seigneuries. This had happened also in Lombardy by that point, which is also something that dramatically impresses the Hohenstaufen, for example. So in Germany we have nothing like this. Also in levels of urbanization, of autonomous military organization, etc. But veritably, in the countryside, the fact that, for example, the respective, say, districts tied to the urban centers were still ruled by noblemen, right, that in turn were ruled by the commune, but that in fact had their own castles, with their own peasants, with their own feudal militias, etc., was pretty much normal thing. Without mentioning that these people were also urbanized. They had castles in the district, but also house towers in the city. And so they were not just feudal lords, but they were also citizens of the commune. And as such, they were owing military service to this at that authority. If the emperor descended into Italy, then naturally, of course, the feudal element would try to emancipate itself from the communal domination. But this would ultimately fail, and so what we see is, if anything, the great Italian houses urbanizing, becoming, say, seigneurial within the communes, and even starting creating veritable territorial states that, as we were explaining the other day, for example, in the case of Milan, for the Milanese armor, rivaled with by actual military force with the greatest monarchies in Europe at the time. Essentially, the Milanese and the French had the same level of military power available, right? And this is very well established also from a historiographical point of view, except you hardly hear that. So, if anything, Italians had, in addition, an infantry force. There is really never, after the wars of the Lombard League were still, in any case, the Italians had always had a decisive cavalry element, right? Italy does not witness, unlike countries like Scotland or England, but this England, it was mostly a monarchically decided doctrine, so it's an exception within exception, but we're talking Flanders or Switzerland, an infantry-only victory. This is very interesting because Italy had actually the strongest infantries in Europe in absolute terms, even more than the Swiss and the Flemish. We're talking the 13th to 14th century. But they had also a lot of heavy cavalry, and that always stemmed also because of the later re-seigneurialization of the system. Europe undergoes, as you know, a great refeudalization between the 1350s and the 1450s. A further ennoblement, like a recognition of feudal titles to the Italian lords. All right. What is interesting about the Italian communes that we'll have to explain better, and especially under this military point of view, is the sensual principle, right? As historically, like, I don't know, the German knights had been those unfree ministeriales. Every country has its own in many ways. The Italians had this, that they were not feudal knights in many ways. They were essentially citizens, right? Rich citizens that could afford not just, I don't know, a war horse or the panoply to fight, but the actual lifestyle. We made lots of videos about, if anything, the knightly presence. This is in Italian communes. This starts properly with the consulate, with the first communal regime that is effectively established by the militares. Made a video about the knights on the Modena Cathedral archvault, dating to the 12th century, by the way, echoing the Arthurian legions to which this figures were dedicated in a way. So that shows you also how far and wide this Frankish military culture went, right? In Germany, in Italy, everybody was reading, say, the French chivalric epos, right? Especially these individuals of higher status that literally incarnated the same knightly feats. As we were saying before, this was really a normal thing after all. I mean, it's paradoxical how it's really the communes that maintain the originary Romano-Germanic understanding of force for the cives, equated to essentially citizens in arms, right, as a duty but also privilege, as a marked sign of liberty, right? In Transalpine Europe, this had actually not survived, right? Most people were under somebody else's rule in a truly feudal sense. In Italian communes, still the idea of you being a citizen equated you to be, to a degree, a sort of nobleman, as long as you could bear arms, in fact, serve in the communal army and fight for your de facto independence, even against foreign control. When we look at the 14th century, in many ways, this original behavior that, of course, extended to the same elite we were talking about before, other than just the average footman, right, changed mostly because of the mid-14th century crisis. Right, the mid-14th century crisis produces a essentially refeudalization of the system, as we saw before. That is to say, the full affirmation of what we intend as the Ancien Regime. But this does not, however, mean that, say, more feudalization equals more knights or more people at war here. No, it's essentially another mini civilizational collapse. It's basically just like the end of antiquity, except medieval civilization does not die, it recovers. It takes a lot, actually, until the 17th, the 18th century. Like, Europe would not regain the levels of growth of pre-14th century crisis, which means, in a sense, actually, that there are ever more people to rather exploit in a way, also for military purposes. This will be evident, for example, in the 15th century, when really after the Swiss model, you have, yes, a lot of infantry and professional infantry that defeats cavalry, but it's not like it defeats cavalry politically, because that infantry is actually paid, and it is thus dependent on the great European princes that are ever more powerful, right? So it's a different kind of balance, very different also from the, at the end of the day, still isolated infantry victories of the first half of the 14th century that instead came from, spontaneously, from rustics, from bourgeois, and so on. And they're quite contingent. They do not really have a future in that regard. And that also, however, correspond, in fact, to a further crisis, a further stratification of the aristocracy that, in part, had also demilitarized during the crisis, because the great powers that are the ones that survive during the crisis. This is very important to remember also. For in every time of crisis, actually, it's still the more advanced places that remain more advanced and tend to be more compact to begin with from a prior basis. We observed this with, in fact, the former Western Roman Empire lands. This is the case, right? Really, from the mid-14th century, Western European monarchies tend towards essentially the modern state, whereas Central Europe, the East, have a different story. Actually, their monarchies fail. They become electoral systems in Central Europe. Then in the East, there is a more autocratic and Mongol steppe influence. So that's also another story, but it takes even longer to grow. In any case, this brings to a further as voluntary demilitarization, because warfare is exhausting. Actually, this great mid-14th century crisis is more the product of the enormous amount of wealth spent for war in the previous generations than, say, I don't know, the Black Death arrived and the system collapsed, right? If anything, this pandemic occurred because people were becoming sort of weaker. Say, imbalances were greater. More wars, more immunity system, more interdependence. So when the system cracks, say, all comes on, but it also exists. And so the idea, especially in the masses, that there is somebody that wants to keep on fighting and resisting, fundamentally ends. You see entire peoples that had been sort of in arms to a degree, civically especially, like, they say, okay, no, we prefer to be ruled by some sort of authoritarian figure that will have now an unprecedented level of power concentration. And that's in part where the sort of even more concentrated powers of the later, say, modern era come from, these princely states of late medieval Europe, so that we do not create problems. We will not rebel in arms more than much. There are attempts, but they fail, especially during the 14th century, the Jacquerie. Also later you have the Hussites. You have different sort of movements, but they all fail clamorously, regardless of all the Fourth Estate or romanticization or heroization of these otherwise incredibly unsuccessful endeavors. And the ruler at that point will engage in what we were talking about before, mostly disbanding the great, bulky, costly formations of citizens and peasants, because also to be effective they had to be many. And so don't think that infantry costs, in terms of cost benefits, that less of than cavalry, that in fact becomes actually prevalent to a point. There are armies like the ones of Milan that we were talking about before that, according to very reliable sources, and this was really the norm also in the other seigneuries out there, but this was the one with the largest amount of power in absolute terms. The scale was the same. By the 40s, the 50s of the 14th century could already count on between 5,000 and 6,000 barbuta, that is to say literal men-at-arms, without apparently having recurred after the battle of Parabiago to the Milanese communal army that technically was still there, because again, it's not like the Romano-Germanic levies disappear. Like, I mean, still today we live, say on the basis of our rights and duties and martial laws, etc., in a time in which you have to go to war. If, of course, like it's not much like based on wealth that I'm in a significant sense, but these institutions still survived in Europe to the same. We're looking at, I don't know, look at the Kingdom of France, etc. And you see, we know that we're infantry men, but these are of scarcer quality for a long while. For a couple of generations, really, they do not seem to make this enormous difference that they could make before. We don't even see them more much, and so you realize that these are virtually entirely mounted armies. So there is something similar in the English armies of the 100 Years' War, the expeditions of the Chevauchés. I made a video about the English army's strength during those operations. We'll have to come back prepotently on the 100 Years' War. But Philippe de Comines says that these Italian signori's armies were the same ones that eventually led to the, say, as a comparison, like as an imitation to the establishment, for example, in the same mid-14th century, we made a video about this, to the first permanent nucleus of the French army. So again, understood as permanent troops, what does that mean? It means that there are some actual soldiers that you do not disband over the winter. And so they're sort of, actually, it's not just that, because that would have occurred already before, but that now are framed, like they're built, they are organized in a fashion that you can essentially keep relying on without having to reform their cadres, where and how. So they're essentially companies, like the ones that had already been existing, especially in the so-called mercenary business, what we call mercenary business, that now, instead of being disbanded, are maintained, right? And these are actually not even mercenaries; they are actual soldiers from within the same France. They could be foreigners as well, but the most important thing is that now they are a sort of national army. France relies, say, the monarchy, the crown relies on that as the core of sort of its own force. It's not much some sort of vassal force, but or original feudal levy, but as a permanent army. Naturally, at the time, they didn't see that would have been the actual beginning of permanent force. This is just an obsession that modernists inculcated in people who evidently have nothing better to think about. That is to say, actual art of war. But it's relevant. This happens exactly in a moment in which also lots of noblemen of the lesser status we were talking about before are in crisis. Right, those Milanese barbutas, for example, were largely Germans. Who are these Germans? These Germans basically are the descendants of the ministeriales that during the 14th century crisis do not know what to do because princes are taking over in Germany as well, with that disarmament kind of thing. These are not ministeriales anymore because by the 14th century there's no juridical distinction really. But these are men who know how to fight. Sometimes they're actually even, again, important noblemen. Right, there is the Count of Saarbrück, and we find high-profile figures. Needless to say, of course, there were veritable German expeditions, imperial in nature at this point, basically subsidized almost completely by the same Italian states, rather than some sort of invasion. So it was in the play between Guelphs and Ghibellines, but that's why, in fact, the Milanese can hire so many troops. And when, for example, Ludwig of Wittelsbach sends letters to the Italian Ghibellines saying, "Look, I'm coming. How many troops do I need to come to come in Italy with?" And the Ghibellines say, "Look, we have more Germans than you can mobilize here in Germany, so just you will count on us fundamentally." And this is so fascinating because it tells you exactly where did all those knights of the previous centuries ended up, their descendants, right, etc. And so again, this is a craft that these men maintain, because when they come back home, they're actual lords to maybe a very modest, when not poor and quite fatiscent seigneury, possession of some kind, a tower or whatever, but they are still, right, the progenitors of the later, say, aristocracy that at some point would have a function in modern armies as officers, as etc. And there's not this overwhelming emphasis on the ancestral aspect, also because many of these people died and others emerged, and so there is also a lot of wealth that is indeed a new indicator of nobility. Think about in France, especially the distinction between noblesse de robe and noblesse de paix, right? There are more traditional countries like England. England does not really have a substratum of bourgeois third estate administrators like the barons who rule directly on their shires. But even there, like, you have, of course, new enriched elements, the third estate, especially from London. And you have an oligarchization that allows for, favorites, people within this clientele to rise through the ranks, to be rewarded, and so on. And so the individual histories can be very interesting, but they're also often very obscure, right? This passes through, again, the exhaustion of Eurasia once again, and so with the disarmament of the large masses of people. Right. The latter estates understood they were sinking. They tried to rebel. They basically brutally beaten down. Peasants at this point still had the chance to have at least a place as the fourth estate in local parliaments, but they failed completely in achieving that. They could. It's not. Let's say it would have not been impossible. Actually, there were good chances for them, but they blew them completely. Of course, there was no room for any kind of revolution or whatever. It was not really the time. That's for when the value of the ancien regime had quite thinned, let's say. But we see essentially a full passage in this just couple of centuries, after all, between the 12th and the 14th century, a passage from the traditional feudal levies to these dégagé professionals, so another way of saying mercenaries, that maybe were even, again, aristocrats themselves. When they came back home, they fulfilled their feudal services to the local king. This is important to stress. But in the meanwhile served abroad. In fact, this had already been the case. I mean, the concept of knight errant had always been about this. That there were multiple allegiances you hierarchically had with one another. Think about the liege of homage, and like the exclusivity that the king seeks for him. Like, there are all the steps that bring to this different sort of power building. But roaming around and fighting had always been the same thing. If you really look, for example, 14th century German mercenaries, I mean, was it really different from, 6th century Germanic migrations? Really, not much. Right, in a broader sense, of course, yes, there weren't peoples in arms that were moving from a place of Europe to another to settle for good, like creating states. No, there is none of this. Actually, the Germans managed just to infiltrate in Scandinavian policy. In Italy, when they were the largest force, they do not get literally anything. They all come back to Germany at some point, right? They made some money, but they didn't settle. They didn't establish seigneuries of sort. Of course, like these countries frequent each other in different ways, so that, as we pointed out, also in the military technique, they're all very intertwined, they're all very similar, sharing styles, techniques. We really observed it very well in the series about regional warfare. But there is a cyclicity in this dynamics, or at least something approximately resemble that is a constant of some sort that is worth noticing, even just in the mental frames. Like, never think that peoples change in the time span of a couple of generations. The more I study history, and the more I realize that peoples are basically the same in basic inclinations, really, in a cultural, personal, moral sense, even from 2,000 years ago. And it is really insane if you think about it, but it's also beautiful, because these identities are really that strong. As we were saying before, the system of monetization, if anything, of military service, simply having enough money to hire whoever you wanted without having to put together like the old theater of calling people to see if they were fit for service, and then preparing all the stuff from the various districts to move with a bigger army. Those surpassed. It was much easier just to have the money to attract those who you needed, to hire who you needed. There were lots of them, as we understood, exactly also because of the crisis. We mentioned the English scutagem. We could talk about the Italian cavallata. It was something slightly, it was basically the same thing. I mean, basically, you paid someone else to go to fight in your stead. It's not even to say that these people, wherever they were, they wouldn't actually maintain a knightly style, a knightly lifestyle, and even, in fact, military activity on their own. It's just that they, to some degree, could just pay not to go to war in a given moment. Right? This does definitely fit a general trend of demilitarization of life, so gentrification, etc. But it takes centuries and centuries to pass from, okay, I'm a nobleman, I have to go to war because that's my entire life and I can't literally live without, to, okay, no, I don't want to go to war, I have nothing to do with that. No, right? It takes a very, very, very long time that far passes by today's video's chronological limits. So we see, especially in late medieval Europe, a type of army that will remain essentially up to the mid-17th century, when some modern national armies start to properly homogenize, even though they were still rising in part to private commissions, etc. But they were, especially in France, right, truly national armies. Essentially, a bulk, in terms of power, bulk of mercenaries, of military professionals. It could be nationals or not. This is not so important, actually. Also because, again, what we understand as nations today that weren't really as... they existed at a time, they weren't felt so strongly as opposed to, I don't know, provincial identities. You know, political factionalism brings always also to civil wars and so on. And some sort of traditional feudal levy that in part does remain, but is still paid, right, according to the later medieval model. In fact, there is not such a great difference between that and the mercenaries. Some militias, they could be found, auxiliaries, allies of some sort. And then also from the king's side, some force that is, as we've seen before with France or Milan or others, sort of permanent nucleus of an army that will eventually grow into the national one. Right? Naturally, if that state made it, you know, to that kind of independent path. So this is really interesting. We see gentrification, not just of the bourgeois within the cities, but also of the seigneurial aristocracies. The professional militarization of some groups of men-at-arms, united, say, gathered in companies and managed by these sort of commanders and businessmen. Think about Wallenstein, just for a later example. and of déracinés of various origin that you could always find, like écorcheurs, they were like probably the scum of the earth that you could send into like looting, killing. It was always there. The expendables of the situation, but also in fact the least reliable. In fact, the best troops were always the professionals that were very involved. They were not so much spared actually, as one may think. These were the stormtroopers of the situation. They were the ones who opened the engagement, especially in Western warfare. That they were central, right? This is the type of army that really consolidates between the mid-14th and mid-17th century. Then, of course, the mercenaries presented some disadvantages. Also, in fact, the more stereotypical ones of lack of actual loyalty, or at least there was a new type of loyalty. It was I made a video just the other day that you watched in great numbers, that in fact was very much connected with the pay, but it would be wrong to consider it as a sort of different way of seeing it from before. As we observed, it's not the great difference at the time was not much that they were fighting for pay, but they were fortestaters. Right, before knights fought, because they were the professional ones. These instead were lesser people, right? Like the Swiss, and basically in the age of pike and shot warfare, they weren't noblemen. They had noble commanders. That's true, like Frundsberg, for example, just to mention like the obvious. And there you know the connection with Maximilian, with Charles V, and so on. But that's, if anything, the greater problem. This is a rabble of some sort. They do not have the same standards that knights have. Not that knights are less violent, but they're more rational, right? They have a greater idea of how to manage men in difficult situations. But now, it was also because of their falling standards, as the same Montaigne observed for his own estate, at least compared to the greater mass of pike and shot, meant that they were called to this, if anything, official roles, or so mostly like a commanding fashion, not much like the warrior that simply and individually climbs the ladder in an assault to a fortification. That is always there, but it's individual. It's almost symbolical, right? Now, the bulk of these forces are professionals, are in that sense elite, but they're fortestators. There are many. They're the masses of pikemen and of other troops. Like so, it's the men-at-arms still exist up to a certain point, especially the mid-17th century itself. Yes, but they're ever less relevant in that tactical role, right? And so much changes that we can't quite cover every change that occurred throughout all the centuries, but I made thousands of videos also for this, for allowing ourselves more space, like for this kind in this kind of videos. All right. Mercenaries were that unruly, but they looked up to their leaders. They thought that there was something sacred about the contract they were under. So there's actually a much more traditional idea of them, and also within the ranks of authority. Sometimes, yes, they were sort of subversive fortestators. We find, again, Protestants in Catholic armies, all this kind of stuff, and vice versa, by the way. But their problem was not much their lack of discipline. Actually, they were the most disciplined troops. Rather the fact that, again, one, they needed to be paid by contract, but after the contract, they were basically on their own, right? So there were civilized ways of controlling them, like, I don't know, the relation between the French army and the Swiss pikemen was somehow ordered. In that heraldic forest that Germany was, like, controlling the Landsknecht was actually a bit more complicated sometimes. Right, but the standards were also similar, telling the truth. right? And the interesting aspect is that there wasn't really anyone who could counter these forces now. Right? Pike and shot warfare had truly taken over the system. If anything, it takes the Spanish to affirm, like with the victory in the Italian wars, that standard that the Tercio embodies of loyalty to that case, to not just to Spain, because of course there were tercios from, yes, Spanish ruled areas like, I don't know, Milan or Sardinia, Sicily, Naples, and so on. There were Flemish troops, there were German troops in the tercios, but they were, however, devoted to the general imperial Catholic cause. Allegedly, they didn't need disciplinary punishments because being part of the tercio, thanks to these standards, was such a big deal that just deserting it meant that you were over as a person. You lost your honor and everything. And indeed, also, the disciplinary standards within the tercio were quite high. There was some kind of nobility injected there that the older hidalgos definitely. Also because they literally couldn't afford a horse at some point. We saw it in later medieval Iberian armies. They had difficulties finding actual horses. Some went on donkey back to war. And we're talking even noblemen sometimes. They would begin to fight on foot during the development also of the art of war in general during the Renaissance, and affirm those standards that are also like the general Habsburgic ones. For example, other German or Italian states began to fight because of that Spanish Habsburgic connection. First, with noblemen that starts as regular pikemen, because they had to earn their chevrons, so to say, through the rank, rising up through the ranks. Of course, like they were managed, like they weren't really. They had some advantage to rise, but they had to prove by general standards that they had gone through that kind of training that the same military action really is. I have a video incoming on the tercio, by the way, and we have to talk about that much more frequently because it's a big topic. We didn't cover so much Spanish warfare so far, but especially in this time, it's basically the most important. There are some attempts, of course, throughout all this period to revive some kind of more national forces, not just like the royal army, right, so guards, other chosen troops, etc., but some other corps. For example, in the 15th century, you have the Franc-archers in France. They weren't even that bad, but they were called for 2 short times, and they weren't so expandable, also because they actually were drawn from some of the more productive estates of the country, except they wouldn't even be a particularly punching force. I mean, they weren't just archers, telling the truth. There was the problem, if anything, during the 100 Years' War to oppose something similar to the English longbowmen, right? And England, again, had a sort of different society. It had done something different from the start, from really the time of Edward, the 3 Edwards, that we were covering also recently. I made multiple videos on the longbowmen and also the crossbowmen, etc. So it's not much what kind of weapon they were using, or it was what kind of troops they generally were, right? They didn't have this terrific discipline. They didn't have much training as well. And in general, they came, again, from estates that traditionally were not so tied to the profession of arms, so that they were disbanded during the 16th century. Every country had this kind of revival, telling the truth, but France was sort of the more relevant because of being the bigger state, right? It sort of failed the most in this kind of attempts and relied on the old cavalry, as well as on foreign mercenaries. But even the former, like the famed French cavalry, albeit remaining of very high standards in contained numbers, could not simply make up for, say, the affirmation of pike and shot alone, right? For example, the Compagnie d'Ordonnance that had turned into the Gendarmerie. So remember, these were men-at-arms, right? Knights, if you want. And they would have actually been expected to perform pretty well, like in terms of efficiency and training. They did not come less to their courage and reputation, but definitely, again, pike and shot battles were not particularly suited to that role, right? It's as if they had been hyper medieval knights, say hyper powerful medieval knights, but in fact in a different era, right? This is not completely true. I mean, the French gendarmes are also able of great acts of prowess, but these kind of troops mostly survive at the fringes of Europe. You see them in the Muscovy, like it's still up to the thresholds of the 18th century, still fighting as literally like medieval knights, and also because that kind of reality, they were obsolete also for Russian standards, admittedly, but by that point, but they still were a thing because the society expressing them was still that backward and did not really have many competitors, let's say, many external pressure to disband them so quickly until essentially linear tactics kicked in, right? So to say that, in fact, some countries in Europe also modernized much faster, like in much more brutal ways. What you see in Western Europe is a more gradual development, thanks to the fact that these were sort of the top-notch forces in the continent, and you can more distinctly highlight all their massive efforts, like the shortcomings, whatever comparison existed. I mean, all the confrontations between the Spanish, the French, etc. during the Italian wars, from Italy to Flanders, where there you have a lot of military school to learn from, right? What is really core to it is not really the difference between a military style and another, rather the level of training and equipment managed by public authority. Because armies, this kind of new armies, cost a lot, right? And they were, as we've seen, mostly mercenary, as a matter of fact. Kings were trying their best also to create these little but expensive armies on their own. And you have massive upheavals. For France, we've seen the wars of religion of the late 16th century, and that's even like sort of the most not necessarily updated country, as a matter of fact, but sort of the bigger one in a unitary sense. And you see there that the clash between the traditionally feudal vocation of the establishment and the attempts of centralization that were also stemming from a huge potential. The French deliberately chose, at the end of the day, not to arm large masses of infantrymen against the Spanish during the Italian wars, and they lost them because of this, right? Because they preferred essentially not to be challenged at home by angry veterans, that those that their estates had been neglected and wanted to, say, cut the head of the king, as it would actually happen a couple of centuries later, then, in fact, like even being beaten, this tremendous efforts of cavalry charges against pikemen and things like these, or something like this. And this is not to say, of course, that any of these forces were just anachronistic per se. They were just balanced in a different way. Say the French had, for example, still excellent cavalry that was useful, as we were saying many occasions, excellent artillery. They had even excellent infantry because they used the Swiss, that however were not mastering pike and shot tactics because they were basically just pikemen. And so the Spanish ended up beating the whole band altogether. Also, consider that the pike and shot warfare was presenting with another issue for especially the smaller states, because it required large amounts of people, of commoners, being drawn to those armies. So it's not just the fact that the older commissions of our rate were becoming de facto obsolete. I mean, we're still continuing it. We've seen it especially in that video about the Scottish lowlands pikemen, like between the 1500s and the mid 17th century. It's that you had to be really a large country to exact such a heavy toll, like thousands of commoners, without essentially making the system collapse. For example, the Swiss had began first to do so, because we're actually a pretty large country like Switzerland. We imagine it also because it clashed against Burgundy. It's a bit like, I don't know, a small system. It wasn't small at all, right? It had really lots of inhabitants, and it could, that were also a bit, admittedly, like more primitive mountaineers in some cases, so the richer cantons were able to, again, frame them in that almost aristocratic fashion in spite of the general Swiss egalitarianism. But there had been issues. Think about the same condottieri age, right? Italian city-states, as we've seen, were very rich, so they could simply say, okay, well, we're bailing out of the idea of a general levy because that costs too much. Actually, a great part of, as you know, the Italian population was involved in pretty remunerative, lucrative business. There was a lot of textile production, banking. We talked about it very often. So even subtracting these highly civilized and gentrified peoples for going at war would have caused a general damage that was better resolved by, of course, absorbing part of these people, especially from the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century. The condotta passes from various types of foreigners to completely Italian, right? But they're not actual subjects. They are, again, sort of random mercenaries. And these companies, as you know, have especially the characteristic of being some sort of pre-packed armies that you just have to hire. This is particularly evident, for example, with the Venetian condotta that was at the time of Charles the Bold, actually, together with the Burgundian army, in fact, the strongest force in Europe, also by actual military standards of organization, etc. In fact, the system did not work badly at all, even in a statal sense, right? That's why also Venice remains an independent power until Napoleon, for example. But, for example, the Florentine case is notorious. Machiavelli's fiasco with his Florentine militia. He was not just a diplomat. At some point, he was put in charge of some military magistracies, and his idea was, as we were talking about before, simply creating some sort of peasant force that, however, lacked a bit like just a general background. These were people simply drawn into formations that would have required a much greater training and military expense to become actual professional troops. The Florentines hoped just to not to spend too much money, and they weren't even just a particularly strong power altogether. I mean, yes, they were essentially it was a Tuscan state, but Milan, Venice, even the papacy, obviously also Naples, were much more powerful. And so the Florentines can handle themselves a bit as long as Lorenzo de' Medici is alive because of his enormous political and diplomatic skills. But during the Italian wars, as you know, things change. There are other fiascos with Francis I's Roman legions that were essentially some French national regiments that turned out to be equally scarce and were just recycled after very bad performances in as provincial garrisons, right? So it's a difficult, tough history. I made a video, by the way, about the native French infantry of the Italian wars, in which I explained these passages, as well as the gradual attempt from the French royal side to organize a much better force, also with commanders who were appointed by the same crown. In the 30s of the 16th century, you see a significant amount of results. At least it's not like by the point the French were necessarily particularly ahead, but I was always impressed by the siege of Freiburg, the Battle of Freiburg, 1644, that was really showing, at least under, they were talking Condé, like an incredible display of stubbornness, of aggressiveness, and then in that case, like of French statal superiority over the Habsburgic Bavarian forces that were defending those avant-posts around the city. There are some exceptions. For example, we mentioned Venice, that used, next to the condotta, so properly the professional element, some semi-professional troops known as the Cernide, which etymologically stands for chosen troops, like some sort of, in sort of generic sense, like legion, like some that actually were not bad, right? But they were still some kind of militia, and so they couldn't simply make everything alone, right? And in any case, their success is particularly connected just with a very good and sort of unconventional way Venice ruled her terra firma. And so very peculiar political and specific conditions. This connection between the fief and military service was still there, though. Right? It was still alive, would remain alive. Again, I mentioned the video about the Mousquetaires de la Maison de Roi because we've seen how, for example, the 4 Musketeers are all styled after figures. They all became captains in the period also of Dumas, which Dumas' novel is set, coming from the small nobility of the Pyrenees, right? And so you understand that those people had not just like quite strong military backbone, but it could still inspire to some sort of social promotion because of that. And this all still within a 17th century France, in that case at least, that is still a feudal monarchy. In fact, what we call like the absolute state also in the 18th century was never an absolute state. Like Napoleon's state after the Code Napoleon is an absolute state in civil law, and still the ones that we have in Europe today. Also from that, stemming from that experience, in fact. And therefore we don't have to think that even when we look at great powers like France or Britain during those later modern centuries, we're looking simply at, national armies, meaning people simply pressed in without distinction based on meritocracy. No, it was a heavily stratified system based on status, on private commissions, people that were of course appointed by the crown, but that were doing so on the basis also of private possessions, what was essentially a feudal background of some sort. The same is true for Spain, for Portugal. Like all countries in Europe basically work in the same way after all. Again, the European warfare is ever more homogeneous over the centuries. Thus, and we've seen it in different videos talking about even apparently banal things like, uniforms, like how much you can grasp from this passage from the Middle Ages and to the modern era, right? Some sort of defeat of nomadism or semi-nomadism even, that was even mimicked still in some, in fact, famous uniforms and even military specialties, especially in cavalry, as you know, that remain to this, not quite to this day, but, yes, actually, in some forms at least. We see, of course, the struggle between the aristocracies, the lower ones as well, that maintain these military standards, and the bourgeoisie. I made a video about 18th century French officers' appointments that shows you really what the dynamic was. It was true that the smaller aristocracies were actually very militarized and very efficient. The French Royal Army, the great 18th century French Royal Army, was very much like standing on its feet because of these humble yet effective, experienced and competent smaller nobility that were indeed pressured by the bourgeoisie that was really trying to get much of the commissions and therefore dispossessing the small nobility, and the higher nobility, the ones say living in Versailles around the king, that was just getting this broader posts at the top commands that, however, were ever more detached from an actual career through the ranks. Nevertheless, the general situation in Europe was very similar, right? And especially ruling a massive system like a leviathanic one like France was so difficult, and the outcome was still pretty good. Like the French Royal Army had maintained some very high standards overall. So when you look at all these changes, like what could be like at the beginning a lord with a little piece of land, right, and then the gradual affirmation of houses, of lineages, etc., and so this greater proclivity to mandatory military service, even as a nobleman, as modernity was approaching, makes you really think. Like there is all a problem of the so-called white widows, meaning wives that had not lost their husbands, if not for the fact that they were far away at war, right, and that ended up thinking their husbands to be dead to actually remarry. And this, of course, happened not that frequently at a nobiliar level, but also, right, there are so many examples, at least so many stories of the same kind. And there is a beautiful passage we can read by Gilles Bellemare, that was French bishop living in the second half of the 14th century, writing the so-called 15 Joys of Marriage. Right, this is actually a very interesting text. It was anonymous for a long time. Then we can read it. It's very meaningful because it's written by a bishop. He was native of the Loire Valley. He died in Avignon. So think the times, because he was born in 1342. This is even technically before the mid-14th century crisis. He arrives to lead up to the beginning of the 15th century. And he actually writes a pretty corrosive picture, almost a bourgeois one, of the so-called aventure that, albeit very accurate to some extent in tone, is somehow desecrating. And so a bit, maybe countercultural, but at least, expounding that sense of the misery of that would become, in fact, such a theme in the more desecrating Renaissance compared to tradition, at least to some extent, depending on where this stuff came from. We can briefly read it. It says, "The 13th joy of marriage is when the husband has remained for 5 or 6 years or more with the wife, and it seems to him to have been so lucky to find such a good and wise woman, and has lived with her in great pleasure and enjoyment. And he is a gentleman. He wants to acquire honor and esteem. He wants to go to the aventure. Right? And he says this. He tells this to his wife, who kisses and hugs him and tells him, sighing and crying, My friend, do you want to leave me and part from me and leave your children without knowing whether we will see each other again? And day and night, she tries to keep him with her so that he wouldn't leave. My friend, he says, I have to go because of my honor, because I must obey to the king, otherwise I would lose the fief that he gave to me. Remember, this is a 14th century thing, like from the later time, right? But if, so let's say the 100 Years' War, but if God likes this, I will see you soon again, right? And then the narrating voice says, and maybe he will go overseas with some army to conquer honor and chivalry. Consider that there were, in fact, crusades still happening against Turkey at this point. And because there are those that have the heart so good and noble that there is no love of wife nor of children that prevents them from making always honorable things. He therefore parts from his wife with great pain, and she suffers in a really undescribable way of this. But he is a man of honor, and there is nothing that will make him stay, as we say. But many more are those that, in order to defend the land themselves, would not leave their wives, not even to go like 10 or 12 leagues away from her, if not obliged and pushed like on the tip of some blade, right? And these really are very shameful for the entire nobility, because they are vile and they should be banished from any honorable company and privates of reputation of nobility or privilege. You understand this is a sarcastic tone, essentially. Nobody that intends these matters would say that these are noblemen, even if their fathers had been. This sarcasm actually hides a great traditional principle, like even in what he's criticizing. And then it says, but let's go back to this nobleman of which we're talking about. He leaves then, and he recommends to his most intimate friends, his wife and children, that loves more than anything else in the world after his honor. And it happens that he will cross the sea, and he will be actually kidnapped. This is interesting because it did happen by the enemies or by chance. Otherwise, I mean, these are the years. So the Battle of Nicopolis, let's say. And he remains otherwise like 2 or 3 or 4 years or more away. And the woman has some great pain for some time. But she will learn that, and she will learn that he has died. Voices, just imagine communications with it. How did you know, right? And so she is grieved by this in an extraordinary way. And just think, literally, this text is very interesting because it makes you look at the psychological side of the story. You don't have WhatsApp telling. I don't use WhatsApp, but just saying like that. Like, how are you? I'm fine. I'm risking my life, but at least you know, in some very detailed way, whether No, you leave, and you just like there are so many voices, like in Bram Stoker Dracula, it will tell you, your husband died. Those were the most mean reasons. Now we will have to deal with the sense of armed pilgrimage and what that means traditionally, because you see there had been a time of crusade in which these values were truly upheld. Here in the mid 14th century, even by a prelate, they are almost ridiculized, right? And they are, at least here, the prelate is of course making some sort of bitter satire, but of course he's himself sensitive, of course, to all this. It's not like he doesn't care, is wishing ill to people. just by criticizing them. He's just making an exemplum, fundamentally. It's also typical literary charm. And so here, this woman is so pained, but she cannot cry forever. And finally, thanks to God, she comes down to the point that she gets married with someone else. And she enjoys this, like she stays well with this man, and she soon forgets the previous husband that she had so much loved. And she also forgets the love of the children, and so the smiles, the hugs, the kisses, and the tenderness that she owed to the husband. So this is actually a criticism now to, of course, the evil in the world, and of course how also in this case the womanly feelings were not so always pure, and so like the husband's just in search for glory and not understanding more important things. Assuming that these were important things, because it depends, like you can't quite judge nor him nor her like in an abstract sense, like these are just examples of sort of criticizable people, but there would be reasons why it was still functional at this point, and for a very long time actually to go on crusades. Crusades last up to the 18th century, and in a sense like a military expedition still remains of this kind also for later times still today. And Wu sees this woman, would say that she actually loves her second husband more than her first. Wu is prisoner and obliged to remain absent as a consequence of his own valor, his own same valor, which is also debatable. Of course, he was captured, and so there wasn't much valor about that, just per se, at least in general, having arrived there, yes. His children are neglected, and she essentially disperses their goods, and so they play and kid together. They do not actually, they enjoy life, but say without achieving much. But when it happens that fortune wants this, that the good man, her noble husband, comes back very, of course, aged and sort of ruined in part, because he has not had eases, and he has remained prisoner for 2, 3, or 4 years. And when he comes close to the country, informs himself of his wife and children. So remember, these are noblemen, so even the smaller ones would have, not all the smaller ones, but France was really big, but men of a certain stature would have, of course, would have been publicly notorious. But he asks about them because he has a great fear that they could be dead, or they could be poor, and know that the good man has thought of them hundreds of times in the prison in which he was closed, and he has really worried so much while his wife was having fun. Perhaps in the same moment in which the good man thought to her and prayed God to protect him, her second husband was hugging her and was, safely with her. Realize that these stories were real, right? They would be heard of, like at the time, wouldn't be so strange at all. So he hears that she has married, she has remarried. Imagine what blow is it for him to listen to such news. I believe that the pain of King Priam of the Great Troy, when he knew of his proud Hector, or the pain of Jacob for the death of the son Joseph, were not equal to this pain. Then he arrives to the town, to actually to the land, and he knows the things for certain. If he is a man of honor, he will not take her back ever again. The other had taken her, and having enjoyed her, he will leave her, and so she is lost in terms of honor, and maybe she will actually put herself on the bad path, so that the good man will have a continuous pain, and will never forget it, and their children will have shame for their mother's fault. Nor the one or the other will be able to remarry, because one of them will be, as long as either of them will be, or one of them will be alive. And it has happened sometimes that by the wife's incitation, the husband that is of great courage will fight, I think here in a duel, and sometimes, as fortune wants, he is won and killed ignominiously, which is a great pain. Many times it happens that he who has the right of her woman is defeated, and who's wrong is the winner. This is very interesting because judicial duels actually are not this great level of settling things, at least in a human sense. And sometimes it happens for the proud and the haughtiness of the wife, for the husband to enter in a clash with another powerful man, how and more than him for their place in church, for example, and that their wives will have the precedence over the other in kissing the peace, and they will contrast and combat each other because one wants to have the precedence over the other, and this will generate among them continuous turbulences, and they will reunite with their friends and surrounded by the luxury of their wives to surpass one another, wasting foolishly their wealth, as it happens sometimes, to the point that they have to sell their own things, their own lands, so that they will not fall into poverty. And for this reason, those that experience these matters have found contrarian issues in marriage where they had entered for finding joy. They have instead found the contrary, even though they do not realize it, so that they will consume their life in continuous pain, and miserably they will finish their days. Now, it's a very depressing story. It's a moralizing script that really was pretty much in vogue at the time to denounce real issues that happen evidently in the way it is described. Now, and because life is also about this, it's too depressing of a note to finish the video on. However, what we had to say regarding this continuity of values, of commitment, etc., is relevant, because of course, aside from this criticism, there is some broader of course push to virtue. Here the problem doesn't really seem the fact that these aristocrats follow the path of a crusade, of an expedition in faraway places, rather their actual moral standards. We observed how pacifism actually undermines imperial Catholic tradition, and how here the issue is of course nuanced, but it's more like we see it more like a criticism of course, to individual worth, because if these people had had faith in one another as much as in God, and thus had the courage of their actions in remaining true to themselves and being certain of things and believing, like this, all this would have not happened even during this expedition, right? So this is not easy, right? This is a reason for which many people today could not bear any of it, but at the time people went through that. Our ancestors went through that, and they definitely experienced similar issues in similar circumstances, and would live on with that. It's difficult. It's difficult, but these are the kind of things we tend not to highlight when we say, well, everything can go fine. It is paradoxically exactly to make things go fine that these higher values were to be upheld. That even the crusade was there for, not to ruin families, but to actually maintain a moral, spiritual standard that would have not been otherwise achieved through other means. So this is actually much more important than it seems. We tended, say, over the centuries to more than else criticize, in fact, whatever the situation was, in this sense, like saying, these people did these things, were crazy. No, it in this sense it's the mark of anti-tradition, and is rather, of course, looking at things that these same people would have thought, like, why am I leaving for faraway places, especially with the means of the times, right? But again, there are some valid motivations. There are some important aspects to consider, such as, for example, here the fact of maintaining their fief. So you could argue, yes, the guy does not go to crusade, but then he falls into disgrace to the king, in front of the king, and what about that? Maybe he really loses the fief, or there are other issues. Everything can go wrong if you want to write a story about that. What really stands out is how things instead worked, even in spite of this. How many things were actually, done without any safety net, if you want. And so this is pretty much a very important side of the story I would highlight as well, and we will come back on the topic because it's a realized one that we haven't quite addressed that often. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.